Welcome to our webinar this morning on the future of trade and how Europe and the United States can join forces to rewrite the post-trade agenda. This event is organized in collaboration with our friends at the European Council of Foreign Relations and brought to you by the EACC in New York, where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the New York office, and I will be your host for today's event. So now with the new administration in the White House, Americans and Europeans need to rebuild a close transatlantic relationship. And we have different viewpoints, obviously, on specific trade issues, but we have both much to gain by working together, especially on trade-related issues, and moreover, to create the closest economic relationship there is between the two biggest markets in the world. Today's program will discuss possible cornerstones to build on, and how Europe's pursuit of the strategic autonomy will affect the transatlantic relationship, cooperative ways to approach sanctions, and how to approach WTO reforms. Our speakers include William Reinsch. He's the Senior Director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the former President of the National Foreign Trade Council. Bill holds the Scholl Chair of the International Business at the CSIS, and he served for 15 years as the president of the NCTC, where he led the efforts in favor of open markets, support of Export-Import Bank, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Pascal Lamy will also join us. He's the President Emeritus at the Jacques Delors Institute and a former Director General of the World Trade Organization. Pascal served for 2 terms as the DG at the WTO, and today he shares his other activities between the Jacques Delors think tank in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, where he will join us from today, and the presidency of Brunswick Europe. Our moderator for today's discussion is Jonathan Hackenberg. He's a policy fellow at the for economic statecraft and the head of the ECFR's task force for protecting Europe from economic coercion. His work at the ECFR, European Power Program, focuses on the economic coercion and geoeconomic, especially sanctions policy. He's also an expert on foreign policy in Germany. Jonathan, do you want to take it from here?
Sure, and hello to everyone on this call. Thank you very much, Yvonne, and welcome especially to our 2 excellent panelists, Bill and Pascal. I'm very happy to be moderating this event today, and I'll just start us off with one question to the panel, and we'll be looking forward to receiving your questions, and we'll take them immediately and give them to the panelists. So it looks like 1.5 months after the President Biden has been inaugurated, it looks like everything's set for transatlantic cooperation again. We've seen his speeches, both at the State Department on foreign policy and at the Munich Security Conference that has been closely followed here in Europe. We've with Catherine Tai being confirmed, we can see an experienced trade lawyer as USTR, trade representative, who thinks, according to her statements, that tariffs can be legitimate tools with regards to China, but who has clearly, just like the president himself, a very different approach to allies than the previous administration. Europe has issued the European Commission a full program of suggestions on how we can cooperate, including a transatlantic trade and tech council. So it looks all set for cooperation. At the same time, now is when the hard work starts on the different issues, be it the subsidies questions between Airbus and Boeing, be it extraterritorial sanctions. Buy American has left Europeans wondering if the Buy American Act, if some elements of Donald Trump's policies remain in place with a different rhetoric. But the comprehensive agreement on investment with China that Europe closed has also made some Americans wonder what what's the deal with transatlantic trade relations, and whether and how much they are the #1 priority. So with all that, let me go to our two panelists and ask, 1.5 months into the Biden presidency, where do we stand on transatlantic trade relations? And I'll go first to Pascal, who will start us off, please.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let me just give you a picture of the US as we see them from Europe, and maybe a few words on a recent major communication by the Commission on the future of EU trade policy, which I think is now clearly under the spotlight. We've been watching the US developments with a lot of attention, with a lot of expectation, and to be frank, so far we did not get any clear new signal apart from a positive rhetoric. We've been listening very carefully to Catherine Tan confirmation process, to her declaration, to the questions that were raised for her. All in all, wait and see, a very cautious approach to all these issues in whichever offensive or defensive side. So for the moment, the view in Brussels is that whatever new shape of the US trade policy is still brewing. A lot of soul searching, a lot of revision, a lot of internal work, nothing really clear, except the expected sort of more center-left leaning of a trade policy for American workers, farmers, and ranchers. The two only signals we got were of course, the unblocking of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as DG of WTO. That wasn't unexpected. It was fully expected, but it came as expected, positive. And then the only clear signal was, as we can see, a sort of willingness to address this long-standing Airbus-Boeing friction positively, i.e. by way of negotiation, rather than just applying sanctions which are mandated by WTO for not abiding by the decisions of the appellate body. So this is the positive side. A word before I finish on this new EU trade policy platform, which was published by the European Commission a fortnight ago. A major inflection in EU trade policy, not a U-turn. I mean, the EU trade policy, for obvious reasons, will remain open. This is the DNA of EU integration, but with a mode which is clearly more assertive, whether with offensive instruments, and notably the enforcement of either bilateral agreements or multilateral commitments with a much stronger emphasis on enforcement application, and this is new. And on the other side, a strengthening of trade defense instruments. Not that this is totally new. EU trade defense instruments such as anti-dumping and anti-subsidy have been strengthened low-key, but legally, really, for the last 4 or 5 years. But that was done a bit under the radar. It was a sort of low-noise reinforcement, whereas the next reinforcements will come with a bit more noise, and notably this coercion instrument on which the Commission and a variety of European stakeholders are working on. And on this, watch what will happen with the reaction of the US to extraterritorial trade sanctions, which have been a problem since the 90s, but which of course have increased with Trump, either directly like Nord Stream or indirectly like the impact on EU chips producers of bans to source Chinese companies in the tech sector. So this is an area of sensitivity. Finally, whereas we all know that there is a lot to do and that there is a willingness on both sides to do more within EU and US to try and bring China more into the tent of what we call and what they call competitive neutrality, and this should and can be done within the WTO. So far, more talk than walk. Again, an area where I think it will take time before we really see the sort of meat of this improvement of transatlantic consultation, negotiation on trade. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks a lot, Pascal, for this probably ambivalent or wait and see assessment of where we stand on transatlantic trade, and of course not to forget that 301 Section 301 procedures are still continuing against France, for instance, but there's some suspended. So in many ways in Europe, the question is what will happen with them? Will that stop or not? On the other hand, very good signs on Airbus Boeing, at least in reports in the media, that there could be a solution. So we'll go over to Bill and see from a US perspective, like when we talked before, Bill, you said this was probably going to be a year of Europe for the new administration. So what's the state from your point of view of trade relations?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Let me say first, it's a real honor to appear with Pascal, who has been and continues to be one of the leading thinkers about trade in the world. And we owe him a debt for his work over a long period of time, particularly at the WTO, and I'm really pleased to be part of this forum. I think we are, I think I'm going to share his ambivalence. We are on the edge either of something big or 4 more years of frustration. And at this point, it's a little bit difficult to say for certain which it will be. The EU has extended, I think, a rather significant olive branch. Its suggestion for a transatlantic trade and technology council was an important step. And if you look at the policy statement they've come out with recently, you can find a number of areas where they have moved in what I would say is in the direction of the American position on a number of issues, particularly WTO issues like the appellate body, and I think some issues concerning China and other things like that. So I think there's an important initiative that's been taken, and I think the U.S. response will be a positive one. The Boeing Airbus issue, which is something that happened last night and this morning, actually, I think is a sign that the United States is beginning to move beyond rhetoric. It's in only 45 days into the new administration. But the announcement of suspending the tariffs on the UK, which in essence response to what they did the same thing in January for us. So in one sense, it's reciprocal, but it's an important step forward. It raises the question, of course, are we going to do the same thing with the EU? And I've asked that question this morning, and I don't have an answer yet. So we'll see, but I think it's a sign that first of all, what I can say for certain is there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes in the White House on these issues. Their statement has been all these policies are under review. They are, but I don't think it's going to be a 4 or 6 month review. They're going to begin churning out actions faster than people think, and this was the first one, and so I'm encouraged by that. That said, you know, with respect to Europe, this has happened before. We launched TTIP with great fanfare in the Obama administration, and positive statements by the leaders of Germany, France, the UK, and the United States at the time. And it ended up, as so many encounters with Europe have ended up, with each side saying, you know, agreement is entirely possible. If you'll just do it our way, everything will be fine. And Europe says that to America, and America says that to Europe. And during the TTIP process, I thought we had made some important progress, at least in getting our regulators to think about the idea that there might be some other solution than the way they've always done things. But you know, for a lot of reasons we don't need to get into today, that didn't end up being a path to agreement. But I think there remains the possibility that the same thing will happen again. I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. That, you know, the EU's lips say yes, but sometimes their actions say not so fast. And so at the same time, they're offering an olive branch. They're moving forward in a number of unilateral areas, which we'll be talking about, the digital space in particular, with individual national digital services taxes and EU proposals, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. GDPR is older, but reflects the same thing. And I think on China, you know, we will see. But it comes back to the question, Jonathan, you raised in the beginning. I think Europe has to decide what strategic autonomy means. It's not been well received in the United States. I think that in my conversations with Europeans, each of them defines it in a different way, which is fine. But sooner or later, it has to mean something. And we'll see. Does it mean finding areas of cooperation with the United States and areas of mutual concern, China and climate being the obvious two, or does it mean trying to be basically a third force perched somewhere between China and the United States? That's a very different approach. I don't think the answer is clear. I think a lot of what we will do will depend on what that answer is.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Sharing the ambivalence, but also pointing out some things that Europeans can do where US concerns lie. So that's very helpful. Maybe let me just go back to Pascal actually with the question that Bill just posed. And Pascal, you mentioned the trade policy review in the EU as well, and open strategic autonomy. As Bill said, Americans are wondering, what does that mean, strategic autonomy? That's that bit in any case. So I'll just give those questions to you. And we have received some first questions, and please feel free, everyone in the audience, to post your questions, and we will get to them. Please, Pascal.
Yeah, that's an interesting conceptual question. Open strategic autonomy is, in Brussels, the new name of the game. It's a sort of fashion, like the notion that this commission, the one chaired by Ursula von der Leyen, was to be a geopolitical commission. So there's obviously the notion that the world is now going to be framed, international relations, by the US-China rivalry for the decades to come, which I think is a very large consensus among geopoliticians and geoeconomists, and that EU has to find its own way within this rivalry, preferably in order to make it nearer to peace than to conflict, which is a sort of European spirit. So, open strategic autonomy means somewhere between the US and China, although not equidistant. This is going to be what you hear. We want to not depend on either the US or China. We want to be able to take our own decisions, but this does not mean that we are equidistant, because on many areas we are much nearer intellectually, ideologically, politically, economically to US than to China. Now, of course, it's always a bit complex, because in reality, open strategic autonomy is the European translation of what the French call sovereignty. But you only need one word to say sovereignty in France, and people understand what you talk about. If you say sovereignty in the other 27 member states, you get a wide spectrum of what this means. Hence the temptation to translate this into European sabir, which is open strategic autonomy. Now, whether there is the capacity to do that in raising the game of the European Union in competitiveness, notably on the tech sector, and we all know this will take time, whether this will result in more or less of reshoring, in my view, not much, but a bit of that. But this will also mean a bit more assertiveness in economic international relations, which is the area where EU nations, EU members agree rather easily. They have a problem agreeing on general security or foreign policy issues, and notably because they don't share the same level of threat in their nightmares vis-à-vis US or China or Turkey or Africa. But as far as trade is concerned, as far as economic issues are concerned, they are much more united. So that's my comment on your question. For the rest, I very much agree with what Bill just said, and notably on the fact, but many of you have heard me saying this very often, that if you want to reduce transatlantic obstacle to trade, to exchange, you just have to knock the heads of a few regulators, and this is the way to go. Removing most of what matters in terms of transatlantic obstacle to trade has to do with regulators, not with tariffs, not with subsidies. We don't have the same problem transatlantic as the one we have with China. The only problem we have is that we don't have the same regulatory system, and that for those in Europe who want to be on the US market or the other way around, there is a price to pay to adjust to different regulatory system. This is the real cost of trade, and it is difficult to address because regulators do not negotiate precaution. Trade negotiators can negotiate tariff or subsidies, but regulators have a hard time negotiating precaution. I cannot trade my precaution against your precaution. It's much more complex than that. And I think this says a lot of why, for instance, this TTIP attempt failed. It was about precaution, not about protection. And this is why it did not work.
Thanks very much, Pascal. And of course, I want to go to Bill and ask how does that sound from Washington, the strategic autonomy bit, what Pascal was saying. But let me just couple it with the first question that's come in so that we get to the questions, and which I think fits very well is, and that is one of our viewers is asking, is there a strategic angle or several of them on transatlantic trade relations, EU-US, for example, Green Deal, climate, protectionism, precautionism, democracy reforms, China and authoritarianism? What's the larger strategic picture? And maybe that fits the question on how the strategic autonomy dimension that Pascal just talked about sounds looks like from Washington.
Well, that's a cosmic question. Let me first agree with Pascal's analysis. I think that he's accurately summarized what's been going on really for the last 40 years between us. And I despair a little bit because TTIP was an effort, I think, to get around that because it was top down. It was, a creation of the political leaders of the key countries, telling the regulators and telling the negotiators what they wanted. Yet that didn't work either. We were not able to bring that to a close, even with political intervention. I mean, so I'm a little discouraged. I think part of the problem now, and it's gotten, in my view, worse rather than better, although maybe Trump had something to do with that, is I think European public opinion has become much more skeptical of American approach to regulation. And I think that, there's a lot of people in Europe who've been persuaded, inaccurately, I think, but have been persuaded that doing a deal with the United States on these issues amounts to a regulatory downgrade, that they will be, in the end, forced to accept inferior health, safety, and environmental standards. And I think that's wrong as an empirical matter, but if lots and lots of people believe it, that makes it a political issue that European leaders so far have either not been willing or able to deal with, and it becomes the prevailing view. So I'm gloomy, really, about the ability to make a lot of progress if you've got public opinion on both sides with some lack of enthusiasm for it. Now, that said, and getting back to the question, I guess I'm going to reinterpret the question a little bit. There are areas where cooperation is, I think, easier and more likely than others. And we now have a president who looks for those intuitively. He is a multilateralist rather than a unilateralist. That distinguishes him from his predecessor. And his approach is cooperation, and let's look for areas where we can work together. There's no better recent example, I think, than the joint announcement last week or this week, I forgot, lose track of time, on sanctions against Russia because of Navalny. This is not a huge matter. I mean, it's a huge matter for Navalny, but this would never have happened in Trump. And what happened here is the U.S. and the EU got together and came up with a joint proposal. You're going to see a lot more of that. And you're going to see it, I think, in areas where it's most likely to occur. The most obvious one is climate, where I think we both have are blessed, I think, with public opinion moving sharply in the direction of taking more aggressive action on climate. And you've got, I think, certainly in this country, corporate America coming to the same conclusion and being prepared to change the way they do business in order to halt the escalation of climate problems and greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions. So that's a place to look. I mean, that's fraught with regulatory issues, but it's an area of cooperation. And I think that over time, China will be an area of cooperation as well. I think Pascal has illuminated the distinctions between us very clearly. I'd only add that I found Europe in general moving in the same direction as we are on China, but about 2 years behind us. And so I think over time, there's going to be some synchronization of view there, because frankly, Europe faces exactly the same challenges from China that the United States does, exactly the same economic challenges. I take the point it doesn't have the same security challenges, but the economic challenges are the same, and they're serious. The Chinese intention, which everybody gets to have intentions, is to create global champions that will outcompete us, and that's a challenge for both of us. And I hark back always on this issue to the words of Benjamin Franklin, one of our Revolutionary War heroes, who said, we must all hang together lest we all hang separately. And I think as this evolves, that's the choice that we face. So you will see, the U.S. engaging China on that question. I think another good one for cooperation actually is the DST, because here you have a framework. You have an OECD process that is well underway. That all the foundation has been laid, the groundwork has been laid, the analysis has been done. You need political decision making, but that's so we're heading toward the end game. And I would note that our Secretary of the Treasury made a very important statement last week when she withdrew the United States insistence on the safe harbor. This really absurd idea that agree to anything you want, but the American companies can exempt themselves from it if they like. The United States has fallen off that position. That's a very important step, and I hope that the European response is to recognize that and find a way to move forward. So I think there are areas where we can make progress, and in doing so, I think each one of those steps makes further steps easier.
Great, thanks, Bill. That was great as an overview of the conceptual questions, the cosmic question that you mentioned, so let's try to get specific here in the second half. And you mentioned climate and the environment, and I'll actually come back to you, Bill, with the one question from the audience. President Biden suggested the idea of a carbon club with like-minded countries, including, of course, Europe, not the least. And so, do you think that's feasible, or is it just rhetoric? What kind of concrete cooperation can the two blocs have in this area? Will the US follow the EU upcoming CBAM? Pascal, we'll go to Pascal after that on this question as well. And I'll ask you to keep it to a few minutes so that we can get to all questions, please.
You want me to go first?
Please.
I think it's not only possible, but I really think it's inevitable if we're going to move forward on climate. It's a different grouping because it's a plurilateral, if you will, that might well include China, which I think is serious about climate. And frankly, it's pragmatic. It's serious in China because it's a political issue in China. And if you've been to China and breathed the air and drank the water, you know why it's a political issue. So I think that these groups are possible. And in what we have learned, I think, in 25 years of the WTO is that consensus amongst now 164 is very difficult. There's a lot of people that are going to stand in the way for various reasons, and I think, that is always the best first option. But we are moving more in plurilateral directions, and I think climate is one where it's likely. The two issues that will be debated here, I think, will be border adjustment measures and subsidies. Ending quote bad subsidies like on fossil fuels, and can we install sort of quote good subsidies on green technology, and can we do that in a way that does not contravene WTO rules about subsidies? Those are challenges, but I think those are areas where the EU and the United States are marching in the same direction, and we ought to be able to work something out. I had a conversation yesterday with someone who works for the European Commission in this area, and we talked a little bit about their border adjustment measures, which are carbon adjustment measures, which are in formation, and they're thinking about different options, and there's a lot of technical difficulties involved, but we both got scientists, and I think we can get over these humps. We now have an administration that wants to have that discussion. We have not had that for 4 years. So I'm optimistic about that.
Very optimistic. Pascal, do you agree?
Yes, overall, yes. Although I think that the timing of this is such that we will see a CBAM, as we call it in Europe, carbon border adjustment mechanism. So remember, it's now called CBAM. And when they've decided to call it CBAM in Brussels, it's CBAM for the whole world. So we Europeans will have a CBAM anytime soon, let's say within the next 2.5 years. Although the CBAM will be waived for carbon clubs. And carbon clubs are a notion which has been there for a long time, which basically says countries sharing the same decarb ambition and agreeing on a similar enough decarb path and instrument, and it can be carbon pricing, and it can be taxes, and it can be regulation. These countries proceeding to the same implicit level of carbon pricing, whatever way they get there, create a club, which avoids adjustment border measures that are there to address different carbon pricing in order to avoid carbon leakages. So that's the concept. I think it will take time before we get there with the US, not least because the way the US intend to decarb is still, let's be frank, dotted. We know in some areas that there are regulatory approaches. There is nothing like a serious ETS system for trading carbon permits, whether you have one in Europe, you have one in New Zealand, you have one in Switzerland, you have one in Norway, you have one now in parts of China, you have one in California to some extent. So this, I think, is the name of the game. It will take time before the US clearly show their hands on how they intend to decarb by 2050. By the way, for those of you who are interested in what decarb should look like, Europe Jacques Delors, which is the Brussels incarnation of the Institut Jacques Delors, which you have also in Paris and Berlin, published a template of what a WTO-compatible, progressive CBAM should look like last year. So you find, and this template has been the one so far which has been mostly discussed within the European Union and with countries with China and India.
Great, thank you very much. Bill, if you'd like to come in.
I was just going to ask,
quickly.
Pascal, I haven't seen that. If you can send me the link to that template, I'd very much like to have it.
Yeah, Europe Jacques Delors in one word, Europe Jacques Delors, one word.eu.
Great. So that's I'm sure that'll find a lot of readers. So that's great. That's the environment. I have two more questions. One, I think that we have to discuss both. We have to discuss WTO and China a little bit more in detail. But before we go to that, maybe first one more question on the bilateral relationship between Europe and the US. Now the EU has negotiating mandates for agreement with the US on the elimination of tariffs and on industrial goods, and for an agreement on standards on technical conformity evaluation. Is that where we'll see progress, do you think? Is a modular approach, of course, in full compliance with the WTO, but is looking at specific aspects, because a comprehensive TTIP is not in the cards. Could we see some progress in these two areas or other areas? And then we'll get to the other questions in a bit. I might address, go to Pascal first here and then to Bill.
No, clearly, my answer is below the radar, regulatory rapprochement. The real name of the game is, my answer is yes. This is the way to go. But as Bill said, we have to do this very carefully because the notion on the US side that the EU are hyper precautionist, fringing the Luddite option is very largely spread. And the notion on the EU side that these Americans are eating very strange food and that we don't want chlorinated poultry or hormone beef is also very well spread. So we have to be very careful about this sort of mentality, but this is the way to go, while recognizing that it will take time. when I was EU Trade Commissioner and Bob Zolik was USTR, we decided to do a sort of example of that. And we took the notion of leisure boats. It happens to be fashionable on the EU side to buy US yachts, and to be fashionable on the US side to buy Italian or French yachts. The only problem being that their safety equipment is regulated totally differently, and notably with the color of emergency rockets, who are red in both cases, but what red means for regulators is much more complex than red. It's a range of frequencies. If I remember well, it took 8 years for regulators on both sides to agree on a common range of frequency defining what red was for emergency rocket. So that's the name of the game. Good luck.
Thanks, Pascal. Very clear. Bill, what do you think?
Well, a great example and illustrative of the problem. I was going to do a rant about chickens, but which to me is a metaphor of this problem for a long time. And this is enormously frustrating. I mean, in both these examples, you know, we both want safe yachts. We both want safe chickens. No one wants to die from eating diseased chicken. Both sides have chosen a regulatory path to achieve the exact same objective. Yet we cannot seem to agree on finding a way to harmonize those paths. And I think what's even more frustrating, we can't even agree on a mutual recognition approach, you know, and saying that, well, your chickens are safe, so why don't you recognize that our chickens are safe too, and then we can eat each other's poultry. We can't seem to get beyond this, and the last literally 40 years are littered with examples of failure on this. It would be nice to get beyond it. And I just don't know what to say. You know, the regulators have not been able to do it. The negotiators have not been able to do it. And the heads of state have not been able to do it. So without a sea change in thinking on really both sides, I'm gloomy about it. But you know, at the same time, the question is well taken. If a comprehensive agreement is also off the table and impossible, then you know you go to Plan B, and Plan B is what we've just been saying is also going to be very difficult or impossible. So this is not a happy part of this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just add one word, this may not be unrelated to the China problem we both have, because these standards, regulatory prescriptions, safety, security, and so on, is an area where China is also progressing quite rapidly in its own way, with larger than China ambitions. So I think there is also a way to look at this issue in saying, you know, why don't we transatlantic try to do a bit more so that we influence the rest of the world a bit more than what China intends to do. There is, in this geoeconomic sort of coexistence, we have to reorganize with China. Maybe this is something that is not just a technical issue. It may also have more geopolitical consequences if we look at them this way.
I think, yeah, that's a really important point, and I'm glad you said that. Because I think we're moving into an era where China is not only developing its own approach to these things, but it's selling its approach to third countries as better than yours or better than ours. And fundamentally, even aside from the standards, fundamentally it's not a rule of law approach. You know, it's not a approach that's grounded in anything but what the party wants to do. And I think, though, that in the regulatory environment, there are first mover advantages, and the people that are developing regulations, particularly in new areas, often end up, and the EU is doing this very effectively, I think. Look at GDPR as an example. If you end up being sort of the bureaucratic leader or the regulatory leader, everybody else has to follow suit. The Americans chafe at that. They chafe at what the Europeans are doing in some of these areas. But the reality is we haven't come up with alternatives of our own or approaches of our own, and the Chinese have. And that then takes us back to where we were earlier, which is that the similarities between the U.S. and the EU are far greater than the similarities of either of us with China.
Thanks. Yeah, that's certainly to keep in mind also on the strategic question, as you mentioned. Now, let me, since we're talking China, and we've actually covered quite a bit the regulatory aspect, but one question from the audience was probably more to Bill. What do you think are the chances that the new administration will roll back the tariffs on China imports that the Trump administration put in place?
Yeah, this is only the 50th time I've been asked that question. I think the answer is they would like to roll them back because they're very aware of the damage they've done to the United States. Even aside, forget the damage they've done to China. They've hurt not only our farmers, but they've hurt our manufacturers that have supply chains that include Chinese parts and components. It's not been, and it also, in its own terms, did not achieve its objectives. So you've got basically a failed policy. The problem is how to get rid of it. And you know, if those of you that have had experience in the trade business know that there's never a free lunch, and the administration is not simply going to abandon them gratuitously. We have too many issues with China, so there will be a negotiation. There will always be a negotiation with China on a range of issues. It's a big relation. It's a big bilateral relationship. We will talk, and the talks will be a little bit different because Biden's priorities are not the same as Trump's. But eventually there will be a discussion about tariffs, and we will be expecting the Chinese to make some concessions about something. I think that's undefined at this point. And if they do, then I think the administration would like to find a path to eliminate the tariffs. But it's not going to happen overnight. I think this is a project that will take probably a couple years to consummate, and it will depend on the Chinese, and it will also depend on what has come to be known in you know, as sort of black swan events, which is the unexpected development that you're not prepared for. And in the case of China, it would be from the U.S. perspective, you know, an incident in the South China Sea, a further crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. They haven't already completely destroyed it. More actions in Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs, threatening actions against Taiwan. These are not trade actions, but they put the United States in a position of having to respond when these things happen. And oftentimes the tool of response is a trade tool. And I think with Biden, you're not going to see more tariffs unilaterally deployed. But you may see them as responses to what the Chinese do. And with Xi Jinping, you can't rule out those kinds of actions being taken. Absent that, I think we're probably on a glide path of a couple years before they go away. And they will go away as a product of consultations and negotiations in which the United States will be able to say, we got something for this.
Right, that's very clear, thanks. And I'll actually come back to regulations and regulatory questions for one second, and maybe address that to Pascal. Someone is asking, one of our listeners and watchers, would it be a good opportunity starting with these new industrial products such as electric cars to build regulations together in a way, transatlantically?
Absolutely, absolutely correct. This is a very good idea. Let's try and address these problems before regulations, legislation have sort of ossified them on either side. It's very clear that, you know, instead of why do US cars need big bumpers, whereas EU cars need small bumpers? And the answer to that is because crash tests are not done the same way, and that's it. So there's a lot of idea in this, while recognizing that, as Bill said, you don't need always to harmonize. Within the European Union, we only have harmonized a part of our regulations. The rest has been mutually recognized. The problem being that mutual recognition implies a large quantum of trust that we are looking at the same thing and doing it differently. But I mean, starting on things like AI, for instance, and there are lots of regulatory ethical issues behind this, that's a way, I think, to go.
Very, very well. And Bill, if you can react as well if you'd like, but I'll couple it up with another question just so
I've got nothing on that. I think he's right.
Great. Well, that's a transatlantic agreement right there. That's perfect. On the WTO, Bill, what do you think will be, is one question, most important policy aspects on WTO role, and I guess to you specifically, what will be the U.S. approach to reforming it, beyond the rhetoric that we've seen, and where do you see there could be movement in the near future? And then back to Pascal as well on that, of course.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm beginning to be a little bit worried about that. I think the new administration is more skeptical about the organization than I thought it was going to be. Not Trump skeptical. I mean, we don't have to worry about withdrawal or overt undermining. But I'm not sure they view the problems as urgent. I mean, I had a conversation about this just yesterday, and in the context of the appellate body and issues like that. And what I got a sense of was let's say I just did not get a sense from my conversations, and also from what Catherine Tai said last week in her confirmation hearing. I didn't get a sense that they're seized with trying to solve these problems immediately. I think their view about their approach will be more constructive than Trump's. I think the Trump approach or the Lighthizer approach was the organization is not serving us particularly well. And if we went back to the GATT days, pre-1994, the United States would be better off. I think he was wrong about that, but I think that was the view. I don't think that's quite the Biden view. I think the Biden view is always to work with organizations and to stay within the organizations and to play a leadership role. So I think you'll see us getting there, but they seem not to have sorted out yet exactly what they want. And in fairness, the U.S. criticism, the Trump administration's criticisms of the WTO on not only on the appellate body, but on their approach to special and differential treatment, for example, and on transparency. Those views are widely held in the United States. They're not Trump views. They were Obama views. And they're also views that are held in Congress as well. So the path may be more difficult and take longer than I thought. I mean, the argument I made to them was that the WTO could use a victory right now. They haven't had one for a while. They need one. And rather than delay or try to, deal with everything at once, can't we pick out some of these problems and solve them quickly? But I wish I could tell you that that's what's going to happen, but I can't.
Thanks a lot. I'll since we have 5 minutes left, and Pascal might have thoughts on the WTO, I'm sure, but I'll just throw them at you, and these 3 questions that are out there, and then and each of you can take another 2 or so minutes to respond. So one question was on the conceptual space. If the world is geopolitically in a U.S.-China rivalry, as Pascal said, what will happen to some of the world's regions where China is increasingly influential, such as Latin America? It's a complicated region, but do you see the EU upping its game there, or will the US try to regain its traditional role? So first question on Latin America. Second one on the USTR report on US trade policy. which didn't mention EU-US data transfers. So data is the second question. Will we see convergence on this priority or disruption from your points of view? And probably difficult negotiation given the very difficult approach to privacy and data protection in the EU and US. Latin America data, and the third question we had was just going through tariff issues between US and China are impacting a lot the EU and EU industries, for example, the automotive industry. What's the EU position and what could the EU do about it? So these three questions to you, these three areas really, Latin America, data, and how US-China tariffs are, tariff issues are impacting the EU industries like automotive. And we'll go to Pascal first, since Bill was last, please.
Yeah, very, very shortly, I'll take two of these points. First, vis-à-vis China, what we have in common with the US is this notion that openness of trade with China cannot remain what it is without China converging more to competitive neutrality. This is what we have in common. We may interpret it a bit differently. We may see China's threat a bit differently, but I think this is the problem. And we both have to explain to China that either they reform their system and that they ensure, whereas it's their right to keep 30% of their economy under a party control. That's not our problem. It is their problem, but this should not have as a consequence to make business life on the Chinese market or competing with Chinese companies abroad, competing with the Chinese treasury. This is something we have in common, and we need to be better at working with China so that they understand this. And if they don't, at the end of the day, both of us, I'm convinced, will, whether Trump or Biden, or whether von der Leyen or somebody else, or whether Macron or Merkel or somebody else, we will restrict the openness because it's not compatible with non-level playing field in terms of subsidy. Now, on EU, on the impact on EU of Chinese tariffs on the side of the US, they haven't always been bad news, although sometimes yes. What really matters for EU companies is the indirect effect of US measures in order to ban non-US or other EU, Taiwanese, or for instance, Korean sourcing to Chinese companies. This is a real problem, and this will have to be coped with. And there is a bit of that, for instance, in the present scarcity of chips on the European market. As you know, we have a big problem because a lot of our car industry in Europe is short of chips, and the chip content of a car is now such that it slows the production of cars. So we have a real scarcity problem, which is partly due to US sanctions on China, the other part being the formidable push that COVID has given to digital, and the fact that if I'm a chip producer, I get better margin with Apple or Amazon than I get with Mercedes or Peugeot.
Thanks, Pascal, and Bill will have the last words, please.
Well, there'll be few words because there's not a lot to say. On Latin America, I mean, the Trump policy basically was to attack Cuba, attack Venezuela, and make friends with Brazil, and that was about it. I think from Biden, you're going to see a more comprehensive approach, but I can't tell you it's a high priority. You know, their priorities right now really are on Europe and China, and to the extent he has international priorities, his main priority, of course, is dealing with COVID and the economy. they'll get there, and I think it will be a policy that's well in line with that of prior administrations, aside from the previous one. On data, I'm not sure I understood the question. I would just say that dealing with a successor to Privacy Shield and dealing with GDPR is a very high priority for this administration. It was an issue they grappled with during the transition, and they believe that coming up with I guess a third version that will hopefully pass muster the next time around is a very important issue for them, and I think you'll probably see something on that fairly soon. On other data issues, I'm not aware that anything has changed from the last 3 or 4 minutes on localization and transmission issues and things like that. I'm not aware of any changes. So I think with that, I'll just stop and turn it back to you, John.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Thanks a lot, Pascal. This was a great transatlantic discussion on the future of transatlantic trade relations and beyond. Really, thanks to the European American Chamber of Commerce, and back over to Yvonne.
Very interesting discussion. I sent you a couple of throughout the program. The folks that I talked to at the Commission are actually working actively on finding agreements on standards, and exactly what our questionnaire suggested. They're looking to technology companies and other industry leaders to do exactly that. Looking at the solutions where the innovation sits, and then based on that, exactly put new standards together. So I actually I'm much more bullish on the situation than our panel appears to be. I think there will be, both sides really want to find solutions, and maybe not in form of a trade agreement, a concrete agreement like a TTIP 2.0 or whatever we want to call it. But I really believe that there's going to be a lot of movement on, the tariff sanctions and the standards specifically. So, I think, the class is, as I like to say, 3/4 full on the future of trade. And, I don't know if the rest agrees with me on that. But with that, we conclude the webinar today. And quick reminder, we will, if you're a member of the EACC and you would like to meet any of the other attendees, we would be happy to facilitate that. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.